David, the shepherd boy chosen to be king. All right, little heroes. Today's story is about a young boy named David, a shepherd with a big heart, a wonderful talent for music, and let's just say, a bit of a knack for getting into funny situations with his sheep. But little did anyone know, David would one day be chosen to be king. Let's start from the beginning, shall we? Now, David was the youngest of 8 brothers. Can you imagine being the youngest of 8? With all those older brothers, poor David was often left out or sent to do the chores nobody else wanted to do. While his brothers went off to do important things, David was left at home to look after the family's sheep. But David didn't mind. He loved being out in the fields, watching over his fluffy, silly sheep. David was a great shepherd. He made sure every sheep was safe, even the ones that were a little, well, let's say, not so smart. There was one sheep that loved to wander off, and David would have to chase it around the hills every day. "Come back here, you little troublemaker," David would laugh, grabbing the sheep and putting it back with the others. But David wasn't just any shepherd. He was also a musician. He loved to play the harp, and he would sing beautiful songs to God while he watched over his sheep. He'd play soft tunes to calm the sheep when they got scared and cheerful melodies when the sun was shining. David's songs weren't just for fun. They were his way of talking to God. Out there in the fields, surrounded by nature, David felt close to God and trusted him with all his heart. Meanwhile, something important was happening in Israel. God had chosen a man named Samuel to be his prophet. Samuel was wise, kind, and always listened to God. One day, God told Samuel, "Go to Bethlehem to the house of Jesse. I have chosen one of his sons to be the next king of Israel." Samuel was a bit surprised. He knew that Israel already had a king, King Saul. But Saul hadn't been following God's instructions, and God wanted to find a king who would listen to him and care for his people. Samuel packed up his things and set off for Bethlehem, feeling excited and a little curious about which of Jesse's sons God had chosen. When Samuel arrived, Jesse proudly brought out his 7 older sons, one by one. The first son, Eliab, was tall, strong, and looked like he could be a king. Samuel thought, surely this must be the one. But God whispered to Samuel, no, not him. One by one, each of Jesse's sons passed in front of Samuel. There was the strong one, the smart one, the serious one, and even the one who could juggle. But each time God said, no, not him. By the end, Samuel was a bit puzzled. He looked at Jesse and asked, "Are these all your sons?" Jesse scratched his head and said, "Well, there is the youngest, but he's out in the fields with the sheep." Can you imagine the look on Samuel's face? He must have thought, the youngest, out with the sheep. Could he really be the one? Meanwhile, out in the fields, David was probably playing a tune on his harp, keeping an eye on his sheep and enjoying the sunshine. He had no idea that something amazing was about to happen. Suddenly, he saw one of his brothers running towards him, calling, "David, come quick! The prophet Samuel wants to see you." David's eyes went wide. "Me? Samuel wants to see me?" He quickly put down his harp, gathered the sheep together, and ran back to the house, probably wondering what in the world was going on. When David arrived, he saw Samuel standing there with a flask of oil, looking at him with a thoughtful expression. David, small, ruddy and cheerful, probably felt a bit shy standing there with his older brothers watching him. But Samuel looked at him and smiled. Then God spoke to Samuel, saying, "This is the one. Anoint him." Samuel took the flask of oil and poured it on David's head, marking him as the future king of Israel. David felt the oil running down his hair, and he knew that something special was happening. His brothers looked on in surprise, probably wondering, David, our little brother, chosen by God to be king. But David didn't feel like a king just yet. He was still a shepherd, and he still had his sheep to care for. So, after that incredible moment, David went back to his fields, his harp, and his sheep. But now he had a new purpose. He knew that one day God would call him to something greater. Back in the fields, David continued to care for his sheep, singing songs and playing his harp. He knew that God had chosen him for a reason, and he trusted that when the time was right, God would show him what to do. One day, a lion came sneaking around, hoping to snatch one of David's sheep. David spotted it and thought, "Oh no, you don't!" He grabbed his sling, picked up a stone and sent it flying toward the lion. The stone hit the lion and it ran off, leaving the sheep safe and sound. David was brave, even though he was young, and he trusted that God would protect him as he protected his sheep. Then another day, a bear came wandering into the pasture. David rolled up his sleeves, picked up his sling again, and faced the bear with courage. With a quick shot, the bear ran off too. David's heart was pounding, but he felt proud of himself. He knew that God was watching over him and helping him keep his sheep safe. As the days went by, David became known as the boy who could protect his sheep from any danger. The other shepherds probably looked at him with amazement, whispering, "Did you hear about the time David fought a lion and a bear? That boy's got guts." But to David it was simple. He trusted God and he loved his sheep, so he was willing to do whatever it took to keep them safe. David didn't know exactly when God would call him to be king, but he knew that his time as a shepherd was preparing him for something great. While his brothers were off doing important things, David was learning patience, bravery, and kindness. He was learning to lead, to protect, and to trust in God's strength. He didn't need fancy armor or a crown to feel like a leader. All he needed was his faith in God, his love for his sheep, and his cheerful heart. And of course, his harp. Whenever he had a free moment, he'd play his harp and sing songs to God, thanking him for the life he had, the sheep he cared for, and the amazing plans God had for him. Little did David know, but those songs he sang to God would one day become part of the Psalms, songs that people all over the world would sing to God for thousands of years. Even now we read and sing David's Psalms, feeling the same love and faith that he felt when he was just a shepherd boy, connecting to Jesus. Now, my dear little ones, you might wonder, what does David's story have to do with Jesus? Just as David was chosen to be a shepherd and a king, Jesus is our good shepherd and our king. David protected his sheep and cared for them, just as Jesus cares for us and leads us. Through David's story, we see that God can choose anyone to do great things, no matter how small or humble they might be. Bible verse 1 Samuel 16:7. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him." The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Remember, little ones, that God doesn't look at how big, strong, or important we are. He looks at our hearts, just like he looked at David's. We don't have to be the tallest or the oldest to be chosen by God. All we need is a loving heart and a willingness to trust him, just like David did. Dear God, thank you for the story of David and for teaching us that you look at our hearts. Help us to be brave, kind, and faithful like David, and to trust you with all our hearts. Thank you for loving us and choosing us, even when we feel small or unimportant. We know that you have amazing plans for each of us. Amen.